The avoidant disappears with sudden completeness that leaves you confused and anxious, withdrawing from communication and presence after a period of what felt like growing connection or after a conflict that seemed manageable rather than relationship ending. The withdrawal arrives without adequate explanation, without discussion of whether the relationship continues, without clarity about their intentions or their timeline for potential return. You experience their disappearance as abandonment that activates profound anxiety about the relationship's status, about whether you did something wrong, about whether they will ever return, or whether the relationship has silently ended through their unilateral withdrawal. You sit with this uncertainty for days or weeks, cycling through attempts to understand what happened, questioning your own behavior, wondering whether you should reach out or whether reaching out would push them further away. Then the avoidant returns, not with vulnerable acknowledgement of their pattern, not with accountability for the anxiety their disappearance created, not with clear communication about what caused their withdrawal or what has changed that enables their return. Instead, they resume contact as if minimal time has passed, offer a casual explanation that minimizes the significance of their absence, and demonstrate through their demeanor that they expect you to receive their return with relief rather than with questions about their pattern. And you do feel relief. The anxiety their disappearance created dissolves in the comfort of their return, and you find yourself grateful they came back rather than holding them accountable for leaving, accepting their minimal explanation rather than demanding the vulnerability and communication their pattern warrants. You tell yourself that their return proves they care, that their struggle with intimacy explains their withdrawal, that you should be patient and understanding rather than demanding more than their defended position allows them to provide. Yet something feels wrong beneath the relief. Some part of you recognizes that this cycle, the sudden withdrawal followed by the casual return, creates a dynamic where the avoidant maintains complete control while you remain in a state of perpetual uncertainty, where their patterns face no genuine consequences because your relief at their return overrides your hurt about their departure, where you gradually accept less consistency and less security while providing more patience and more accommodation. You sense that what appears to be the avoidant's unconscious, fear-driven pattern might actually function as an effective strategy, whether conscious or not, that keeps you invested while preventing you from ever feeling secure enough to stop working for the relationship, that keeps you proving your worth while they remain defended, that maintains their power through your anxiety about loss. This recognition finds you exactly when you need it, when you are questioning whether to accept another return after another unexplained withdrawal, when you are wondering whether you should continue tolerating patterns that harm you in hope that the avoidant will eventually develop a capacity for consistency they have never demonstrated across multiple cycles of the same behavior. The temporary discard creates exactly the anxiety they need you to feel. The avoidance withdrawal operates with particular psychological precision in how it activates your attachment system, generating anxiety that serves a crucial function in maintaining a dynamic where you remain invested while they retain control. The withdrawal arrives at a moment when connection has been building, when you have begun feeling more secure in the relationship, when the avoidance presence has been consistent enough that you started relaxing your hypervigilance about potential loss. This timing is not coincidental. The avoidance nervous system becomes activated precisely when connection deepens toward genuine intimacy, when their defenses detect that emotional closeness has reached a threshold that feels threatening to their defended autonomy. The withdrawal functions as a circuit breaker that interrupts intimacy before it reaches levels that would require sustained vulnerability the avoidance defensive structure cannot tolerate. The sudden quality of the withdrawal intensifies its psychological impact by providing no preparation, no gradual distancing that would allow you to adjust to decreased contact, no communication that would frame the separation as temporary, or that would provide a timeline for reconnection. The avoidant simply disappears, stops responding to messages, becomes unavailable, removes their presence from your life with a completeness that forces you to question whether they are gone temporarily or permanently. This ambiguity about whether the withdrawal represents a brief space or a permanent ending generates maximal anxiety because human attachment systems respond most intensely to uncertain threat. If you knew definitively that the avoidant would return in 1 week, your anxiety would remain bounded by that certainty. If you knew definitively that the relationship had ended, your attachment system would begin the grief process rather than remaining activated in hope of reconnection. The uncertainty the avoidance withdrawal creates keeps your attachment system in sustained activation, generating anxiety that persists across the entire duration of their absence. This anxiety serves a crucial function for the avoidant by ensuring that you remain oriented toward them during their absence, that you think about them constantly despite their withdrawal, that you remain invested in the relationship even when they provide no reciprocal investment. The anxiety prevents you from moving forward or from directing your energy elsewhere because your nervous system remains focused on resolving the uncertain threat their withdrawal created. You cannot fully disengage emotionally because you do not know whether the relationship continues or has ended. You cannot invest in other potential connections because you remain psychologically bonded to the avoidant through the unresolved anxiety their disappearance generated. The temporary discard keeps you effectively frozen in a relationship with the avoidant, even during periods when they provide no actual relationship, ensuring their continued significance in your life without requiring their continued presence. The anxiety the withdrawal creates also functions to make their eventual return feel like relief rather than like something they owe you after creating the anxiety through their unilateral withdrawal. The avoidance disappearance generates such profound discomfort, uncertainty, self-questioning, and fear of permanent loss that when they return, you experience their presence as a resolution of distress rather than as an inadequate offering that should not satisfy you. The contrast between the anxiety of their absence and the relief of their return makes their mere return feel like a gift rather than like a minimum expectation, makes their resumed presence feel like enough despite them providing no accountability, no vulnerability, no change in the patterns that caused the withdrawal. The avoidance creation of anxiety followed by relief trains you to accept their return gratefully rather than to demand the consistency that would prevent the anxiety-producing disappearances from occurring repeatedly. The temporary quality of the discard particularly serves the avoidance needs by maintaining your investment without requiring their transformation. If the avoidant disappeared permanently, you would eventually complete the grief process and redirect your energy elsewhere, eliminating you as an option for them. If the avoidant remained consistently present, they would face sustained intimacy that activates their defensive anxiety, requiring them either to develop a capacity for that intimacy or to end the relationship definitively. The temporary discard allows the avoidant to have both. They can regulate their anxiety about intimacy through periodic withdrawal while maintaining your investment through periodic return, never facing consequences that would force genuine examination of their patterns because the pattern itself prevents consequences from accumulating. The anxiety the discard creates in you also prevents you from seeing the pattern clearly while you are experiencing it. Your activated attachment system focuses your attention on resolving the immediate threat, getting them back, understanding what went wrong, and figuring out how to prevent future withdrawal. This crisis-oriented focus prevents you from stepping back to observe that the withdrawal itself represents the pattern, that the cycle repeats with predictable regularity, that the return never includes genuine change that would prevent future disappearances. The anxiety keeps you focused on surviving each individual cycle rather than recognizing that the cycle itself is the problem, that someone who repeatedly discards you temporarily is demonstrating fundamental unsuitability for a healthy relationship, regardless of whether they return after each discard. The withdrawal also creates anxiety specifically calibrated to make you more accommodating and less demanding when the avoidant returns. The fear their disappearance generated makes you grateful for whatever they offer upon return, makes you hesitant to express hurt or to establish boundaries that might trigger another withdrawal, and makes you willing to accept their minimal explanation and their casual resumption of contact. Because holding them accountable feels risky when you just experience the profound discomfort of their absence. The anxiety the discard creates thus serves a double function. It keeps you invested during their absence while making you more manageable and less challenging of their patterns when they return. Understanding that the temporary discard creates exactly the anxiety the avoidant needs you to feel requires recognizing that the pattern functions too effectively to be merely an unconscious fear response. The timing of withdrawals when intimacy increases, the sudden quality that maximizes uncertainty, the temporary duration that prevents your complete disengagement, and the lack of communication that maintains ambiguity all combine to create a psychological state in you that serves the avoidant's defended position perfectly. Whether the avoidant consciously strategizes this pattern or whether their defensive structure has simply learned through trial and error what effectively maintains your investment while protecting their defended comfort becomes less relevant than recognizing that the pattern functions as a control mechanism that keeps you hooked through anxiety management that the avoidance withdrawals and returns carefully orchestrate. They return with just enough to restore hope, but never enough to provide security. The avoidance return after a period of withdrawal demonstrates sophisticated calibration in how much investment they provide, offering sufficient presence and apparent care to restore your hope that the relationship can work while withholding the consistency and vulnerability that would allow you to feel genuinely secure. The avoidant seems to possess an intuitive understanding of exactly how little they can offer while still maintaining your investment, how to provide the minimum necessary to keep you engaged without giving so much that they face sustained intimacy their defensive structure cannot tolerate. This precision in offering just enough while withholding too much keeps you in a perpetual state of working for the relationship, hoping for more, and believing that transformation is possible if you remain patient and understanding. The avoidant returns typically with warmth and engagement that feels genuine in the moment, creating the impression that something has shifted during their absence, that they missed you and recognized during the withdrawal how much you matter to them. They may initiate contact with sweetness, may demonstrate temporary increased availability, and may share a vulnerable moment that suggests they are ready to open up in ways they could not before the withdrawal. This initial presentation upon return generates your hope because it feels like evidence that the withdrawal created productive reflection, that absence made them realize what they have with you, and that this time might be different because they seem more present or more emotionally available than before the discard. Yet the increased presence and engagement the avoidant demonstrates upon return proves temporary rather than representing genuine transformation. After a brief period, days or weeks, depending on how long the withdrawal lasted, the avoidance behavior reverts to patterns that preceded the discard. The warmth fades into their usual defended distance, the availability decreases back to their baseline minimal presence, and the vulnerability they briefly demonstrated disappears as their defenses reconsolidate after the temporary softening their return required. You find yourself back in the same dynamic that existed before the withdrawal, with the same lack of consistency, the same defended distance, and the same inadequate presence that creates perpetual longing for more than the avoidant demonstrates capacity to provide. The just enough quality of what the avoidant offers upon return specifically targets your hope by providing evidence you can interpret as progress while never providing sufficient change to actually meet your needs. The avoidant shares one vulnerable moment, and you interpret this as a sign they are developing capacity for emotional intimacy despite that single moment being followed by weeks of defended opacity. The avoidant maintains consistent contact for a few days, and you believe they have learned to prioritize the relationship despite that consistency degrading back to sporadic availability within a short period. The avoidant makes a promise about doing better, and you invest hope in that promise despite their history demonstrating that promises do not translate into sustained behavioral change. Each minimal gesture the avoidant offers becomes, in your hope-oriented interpretation, evidence that transformation is occurring, that your patience is paying off, and that the relationship is moving toward the security and consistency you need. The never enough aspect of what the avoidant provides manifests in how their offerings consistently fall short of what would allow you to feel secure. You need consistent presence, and they offer sporadic availability. You need emotional vulnerability, and they offer defended surface level sharing with occasional glimpses beneath their defenses. You need clear commitment, and they offer ambiguous statements that could be interpreted multiple ways. You need accountability for their patterns, and they offer minimal acknowledgement followed by a return to those same patterns. The gap between what you need and what they provide remains constant across multiple cycles, yet the just enough quality of their minimal offerings combined with your hope prevents you from accepting that this gap represents fundamental incompatibility rather than temporary limitation that the avoidant will eventually overcome. The calibration the avoidant demonstrates in providing just enough while withholding too much suggests either a conscious strategy or a deeply ingrained defensive pattern that has learned through experience exactly what maintains others' investment. The avoidant seems to know that providing nothing would cause you to disengage permanently, so they offer something. Yet they also seem to know that providing genuine security would require sustained vulnerability and consistency they cannot or will not provide, so they withhold enough to prevent you from ever relaxing into secure attachment. This careful balance keeps you perpetually working, perpetually hoping, and perpetually investing in potential rather than receiving actual adequate partnership. The just enough offerings also function to make you feel that security is almost within reach, that the relationship is on the verge of transforming into what you need, and that just a bit more patience or understanding will tip the balance toward the avoidant developing a capacity they have not demonstrated. This sense that security is imminent keeps you invested far longer than you would remain if you accepted that the avoidant's current demonstrated capacity represents their actual capacity rather than a temporary limitation. You tell yourself they're getting better when they offer slightly more than their previous minimum, interpreting small fluctuations in their defended position as a trajectory toward genuine change, rather than recognizing these fluctuations as variations within their consistent pattern of inadequate presence. Understanding how the avoidant returns with just enough but never enough requires recognizing that maintaining your hope while preventing your security serves the avoidant's defended needs perfectly. Your hope keeps you invested, keeps you accommodating their patterns, and keeps you providing the patience and understanding their defended position requires from partners. Your lack of security keeps you working for the relationship, keeps you trying to earn more from them, and keeps you in a position where you provide maximum investment while they provide minimum reciprocation. If the avoidant provided genuine security, you would stop working so hard because secure attachment allows relaxation rather than requiring constant effort to maintain connection. If the avoidant provided nothing, you would disengage. The just enough but never enough calibration maintains a perfect dynamic for the avoidant's defended comfort. You remain maximally invested while they remain minimally vulnerable. You continue hoping while they continue withholding, and you keep providing while they keep taking without adequate reciprocation. The cycle conditions you to accept less while providing more. The repeated pattern of the avoidance withdrawal followed by their return creates a powerful conditioning effect that progressively alters your baseline expectations, your standards for acceptable treatment, and your willingness to tolerate inadequate partnership in hope that temporary improvement will become permanent transformation. Each cycle of discard and return operates as a training session that teaches your nervous system and your psychology to accept less consistency, less security, and less reciprocation than you consciously know you need and deserve. The conditioning occurs beneath your conscious awareness through mechanisms your rational mind cannot easily override because the conditioning operates at the level of nervous system response and emotional pattern rather than at the level of conscious choice. The cycle begins with the avoidant providing a baseline level of presence, perhaps sporadic contact, minimal emotional availability, and inconsistent follow-through on plans or commitments. This baseline feels inadequate to you, generates longing for more, and creates a sense that the relationship lacks what you need to feel secure. Yet you tolerate this baseline while hoping it will improve, while believing that the avoidance defended position will gradually soften, and while maintaining faith that your patience will eventually be rewarded with increased availability and consistency. Then the avoidant withdraws completely, discarding you temporarily through their disappearance and radio silence. This withdrawal creates such profound discomfort, anxiety, loss, and fear that the avoidant's previous inadequate baseline suddenly appears desirable in comparison to their complete absence. When the avoidant returns and resumes providing their baseline inadequate presence, you experience relief and gratitude rather than recognizing that they have simply returned to offering what was already insufficient before they left. The contrast between their complete absence and their returned baseline presence makes that baseline feel like abundance rather than like inadequacy. Your nervous system responds to the relief of their return, the decrease in anxiety, and the resolution of uncertainty with positive reinforcement that trains you at a subconscious level to accept and even appreciate treatment that you previously recognized as inadequate. The cycle has successfully conditioned you to feel grateful for an inadequate baseline that you were previously hoping would improve. The conditioning intensifies across repeated cycles because each withdrawal and return lowers your baseline expectations further. The first temporary discard might make you grateful to return to the avoidant's previous level of presence. The second temporary discard conditions you to accept even less, perhaps even more sporadic contact or even more defended emotional unavailability, because anything more than complete absence now triggers your relief response. Across multiple cycles, your standards erode progressively as each withdrawal resets your baseline for what feels acceptable downward. As each return conditions you to be grateful for less than what you accepted in the previous cycle, you find yourself eventually accepting and defending treatment that you would have immediately rejected as inadequate if someone had offered it at the relationship's beginning. The conditioning also operates by training you to provide more investment, more patience, and more accommodation with each cycle. After each return, you increase your efforts to prevent future withdrawal. You become more careful about expressing needs, more accommodating of the avoidance defended limitations, and more willing to take responsibility for relational problems that actually stem from their patterns. You tell yourself that your increased understanding and patience will help them feel safe enough to remain present consistently, that your improved management of your own expression and needs will prevent triggering their defensive withdrawal. The cycle thus conditions you not only to accept less from them, but also to provide more of yourself, more emotional labor, more accommodation, and more suppression of your legitimate needs in a desperate attempt to stabilize a relationship that the avoidance patterns make inherently unstable. The conditioning becomes particularly insidious because it operates through intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful form of behavioral conditioning that exists. The avoidant does not withdraw on a predictable schedule that would allow you to anticipate and prepare for their absence. They withdraw unpredictably, sometimes after periods of increased closeness, sometimes after conflict, and sometimes with no apparent trigger you can identify. This unpredictability means you cannot predict when the painful withdrawal will occur, creating a constant low-level anxiety that keeps you in a hypervigilant state, attempting to prevent the next discard. When the avoidant remains present for an extended period or shows a brief increase in availability, your nervous system experiences relief and hope that gets reinforced as a positive outcome of your increased efforts, conditioning you to continue trying harder despite no evidence that your efforts actually influence the avoidance patterns. The intermittent nature of the avoidance presence, sometimes available, sometimes withdrawn, occasionally more engaged, and usually defended, creates an addiction-like psychological state where you become hooked on pursuing the positive reinforcement of their availability, despite that availability being unpredictable and insufficient. Your nervous system begins craving the high of their presence and engagement specifically because that presence is inconsistent. If the avoidant were consistently unavailable, you would grieve and move on. If they were consistently available, you would relax into security. The intermittent pattern keeps you in active pursuit, constantly working for the next moment of connection, constantly hoping that this time their presence will stabilize into consistency, and constantly providing more of yourself in an attempt to earn security they never adequately provide. The conditioning also trains you to suppress your own awareness of the pattern's harmful nature. When you begin recognizing that the cycle is repeating, that the avoidance return does not include genuine change, and that you are accepting less while providing more, your conscious awareness threatens to disrupt the dynamic by motivating you to establish boundaries or to disengage. The relief you feel at each return, combined with the hope the avoidance minimal gestures generate, serves to suppress this threatening awareness. You talk yourself out of seeing the pattern clearly by focusing on moments of connection rather than on overall inadequacy, by interpreting minimal gestures as evidence of progress rather than as an unchanged pattern, and by prioritizing hope over accumulated experiential evidence that the pattern will continue repeating indefinitely. Understanding how the cycle conditions you to accept less while providing more requires recognizing that human nervous systems are far more influenced by patterns of reinforcement than by conscious, rational assessment. You may know intellectually that the avoidance pattern is harmful, that you deserve better, and that their temporary returns do not constitute genuine change. Yet the conditioning operates beneath conscious knowing, training your nervous system to respond with relief and gratitude to treatment that should generate your rejection and boundaries. The cycle exploits fundamental vulnerabilities in human attachment psychology. The relief we feel when threat resolves, the hope that emerges from intermittent positive reinforcement, and the increased investment we provide when pursuing unpredictable reward. Breaking the conditioning requires not just intellectual recognition of the pattern, but active disruption of the cycle through enforced boundaries that prevent the avoidant from continuing to condition you through their withdrawal and return pattern.